Something historic has just shifted inside the African Union, even if the full meaning has not yet been widely unpacked in public. African Union leaders meeting at a summit in Addis Ababa adopted a landmark resolution describing slavery, forced deportation, and colonialism as genocide and crimes against the peoples of Africa, formally written into an AU decision. Member states also agreed to designate 30th November as the African Day of Tribute to African martyrs and victims of transatlantic slave trade, colonization, and apartheid. A permanent day of remembrance, which is the resolution, commits the Union to seek broader international recognition of this legal framing in global debates on crimes against humanity. On paper, this looks like a decisive break with older habits of treating colonialism mainly as a historical episode rather than as a crime category in law. At the same time, a number of AU member states continue to host French, United States, or European Union military facilities, depending heavily on external budgetary and program support, and also operate within security partnerships shaped by European institutions and other non-African actors. Many of these same governments have backed or accepted firm regional measures against revolutionary leaders in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, including suspensions and sanctions in coordinations with ECOWAS and other partners. In Bamako, Ouagadougou, and Niamey, decisions from Addis Ababa and Abuja are often read against the backdrop of conflicts, foreign military withdrawals, and contested security arrangements. This raises a sharp question. Does the new criminalization of slavery and colonialism mark the beginning of a genuine legal shift in how power is judged, or mainly a stronger vocabulary around an order that still prioritizes existing alliances? The episode that follows explores how the AU is now formally framing colonialism as a crime, how Sahel revolutionary leaders are breaking from ECOWAS and foreign-backed security frameworks, and why that coalition between legal norms, rebellion, and sovereignty could reshape who defines order in Africa. Inside meetings at African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa, officials and member states continue to refine language on unconstitutional changes of government, drawing on a long-standing AU and OAU doctrine against what they define as undemocratic seizures of power. This framework, which is rooted in the AU Constitution Act, adopted on 11 July 2000, the Lomé Declaration of July 2000, and the African Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance, adopted on 30th January 2007, has already led to suspensions of countries such as Mali, Burkina Faso, Guinea, Niger, Sudan, and Gabon after recent revolutionary transitions. Publicly senior AU figures describe this stance as a zero-tolerance policy intended to protect constitutions, safeguard stability, and prevent abrupt changes in political leadership. The legal language being tightened now operates at the same time that revolutionary leaders in the Sahel are openly rejecting elements of the wider international security order in which many AU members still participate. Now here is where it gets interesting. The AU presents itself as both symbol and referee of continental political order, having evolved from the Organization of African Unity, founded on 25th May 1963, into an institution equipped with sanctions, suspensions, and legal instruments to respond to governments that come to power outside elections. Its Peace and Security Council and related organs repeatedly affirm that non-electoral transitions constitute serious violations of continental norms, regardless of claims about insecurity, corruption, or foreign interference. From Addis Ababa, the storyline emphasizes rules, protocols, and the credibility of a rule-based African system. On the ground in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, those same formulations are received in societies that have lived through years of conflict and poverty and have seen foreign troops arrive and depart under shifting mandates. And this is the part that doesn't get discussed enough. In communities that supported leaders who expelled foreign forces and cancelled certain defense accords, it is often these new revolutionary authorities who are branded unconstitutional, while earlier governments that negotiated security and resource agreements with outside powers remain recognized as constitutional, despite deep popular criticisms amongst them. Now think about that for a second. A leader who signs away mining rights to a foreign corporation is constitutional. But a leader who cancels that agreement and tells foreign troops to leave is unconstitutional. As the AU strengthens its legal instruments against unconstitutional changes of government, a deeper tension emerges over whether the law is being applied purely to defend procedure or whether it also reflects unease with a particular kind of rebellion against existing security and political arrangements. Across the Sahel, revolutionary leaders in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger have presented themselves as heads of a rupture with past dependency on foreign military deployments, foreign currencies, and externally designed security strategies. In recent years, these governments have cancelled or revised long-standing defense and security agreements. Mali terminated its 2014 defense accord with France and ordered French operations Barkhane forces to withdraw, completing their departure by August 2022. Burkina Faso followed by ending France's military presence in February 2023, and Niger also revoked the 2012 military cooperation agreement with France and ordered French troops out by December 2023, while also ending the US military presence at the air base 201 near Agadez by August 2024. They publicly accused former colonial powers and other actors of contributing to persistent insecurity and economic vulnerability. In September 2023, the three states formalized their coordination by creating the Alliance of Sahel States as a mutual defense pact through the Lipako-Goma Charter, signed on 16 September 2023. And in July 2024, they went further by signing a treaty in Niamey, establishing a Confederation of Sahel states to deepen integration. These steps coincide with their announcement withdrawal from ECOWAS, a joint declaration issued on 28 January 2024, with formal departure completed on 29 January 2025, and moves to build alternative regional mechanisms. For many Pan-African commentators and sections of the diaspora, these developments are interpreted less as simple instability and more as attempts to correct what they see as structural imbalances in security and economic arrangements. Analysts have long documented how foreign military bases, unequal resource contact, and external budget support can leave states formally sovereign but heavily constrained in practice. The Sahel's revolutionary leaders now present their actions as putting decolonization into practice by terminating or reconfiguring arrangements they regard as one-sided, even at the cost of sanctions, aid suspensions, or diplomatic isolation. From Addis Ababa and Abuja, however, the same moves are frequently framed as destabilizing disruptions that endanger regional trade, security coordination, and the principle that political power should change hands through elections rather than through revolutionary action. Official communications from AEU and ECOWAS meetings highlight concerns about cross-border insecurity and fragmentation of integration projects. As the Sahel revolutionary government described their agenda as decolonization, while AU and ECOWAS instruments define their path to power as or constitutional, the unresolved questions becomes which actors ultimately decide which claims to liberation and sovereignty carry legal and political legitimacy. On paper, the African Union is mandated to act as a collective political voice of more than 1.4 billion Africans on issues of peace, security, democracy, and development. In practice, and this is where it gets uncomfortable, a significant share of its peace operations, programs, and technical activities has relied on financial contributions, training and logistical support from European institutions, international financial bodies, and bilateral partners outside Africa. The EU alone has contributed hundreds of millions of euros to AU peace and security operations over the past decade. The AU's main headquarters complex in Addis Ababa itself, which was inaugurated on January 28, 2012, was constituted as a gift financed by the Chinese government at a cost of about $200 million. That single building tells you everything about the tension between continental ambition and reliance on external funding. This structural dependence forms part of the background to every major decision the UN makes. When AU organs adopt firm positions on revolutionary transitions in the Sahel and endorse a coordinate measure such as suspension, they do so while many of their activities are funded or supported by the same external powers whose military presence and influence the Sahel's revolutionary leaders denounce. Sanctions regimes, suspension decisions, and legal pronouncements about unconstitutional changes of government operate inside an environment where donor priorities, strategic partnerships, and budget circles remain central consideration. Now, the question you have to ask is, can the judge be independent when the plaintiff is paying the cost electricity bill? Funny. But at the same time, the union has now moved to promote a more radical legal framing of history by declaring slavery, forced deportation, and colonization to be genocide and crimes against African peoples. By setting 30th November as a continent-wide day of tribute to those affected, AU leaders have committed to seeking international recognition of this stance, signaling a willingness to confront aspects of the global order built during and after colonial rule. The result is an institution that in one domain is challenging historical injustice in law, while in another domain it is applying existing norms and sanctions to contemporary political crises that are partly shaped by that same historical legacy. One hand writes that the resolution condemning colonialism. The other hand signs the suspension of governments that say they are fighting its modern continuation. In AU communications and summit decisions on constitutional changes and governments, the language is detailed and categorical. Revolutionary transitions and other non-electoral changes of power trigger suspensions from AU activities. Possible targeted sanctions and can be accompanied by travel bans and other restrictive measures coordinated with regional bodies. This framework has been applied to recent revolutionary transitions in Mali, which was suspended after Colonel Assimi Goïta's consolidation of power on 24 May 2021. Burkina Faso was suspended after Captain Ibrahim Traoré took leadership on 30th September 2022. Guinea was also suspended after Colonel Mamadi Doumbaya's transitions in 5th September 2021. Niger also was not left out of the suspension after General Abdurrahmane Tiani's transition on 26 July 2023. Sudan and Gabon officials present this as evidence that the continent will not legitimize armed power transitions. Now compare that to the other side. AU legal instruments and public decisions contain fewer explicit enforcement tools directed at issues such as unequal resource contracts, foreign-led military operations, or constitutional amendments that extend incumbent time in office. Even though these concerns are widely raised in African public debates, where are the suspensions for leaders who changed their constitutions to stay in power for 20 to 30 years? Where are the sanctions for governments that sign resource deals, giving foreign corporations extraction rights at a fraction of fair market value? For communities most affected by conflict and contractive economic arrangements, the most tangible violence is often experienced not as a single dramatic change in leadership, but as years of insecurity, displacement, and stalled development linked to both domestic governance and external involvement. Pan-African analysts and civil society voices have questioned why swift leadership changes automatically activate formal sanction mechanisms, while long-running patterns of external influence over security planning or economic policy rarely receive comparable legal treatment at AU level. The new AU resolution on slavery and colonization indicates a collective readiness to name historical injustices as crimes. Yet, the operational focus of sanctions and suspensions remains directed primarily at present day. Revolutionary governments, rather than at the complementary legacies these governments say they are confronting. This produces an ethical and political dilemma in how constitutionalism is defended. When legal order is strongly protected in terms of formal procedures, many citizens argue that the substance of justice, equality, and sovereignty is still contested. The risk arises that legal frameworks are perceived as shielding an unequal status quo. If stability is defined mainly through continuity with donor-backed institutions and regional instruments, tensions intensify when local populations and new revolutionary authorities conclude that the existing model itself is no longer acceptable and acts outside its parameters. After being suspended from AU activities and facing strict economic and political sanctions from ECOWAS, including border closures, trade embargoes, and financial restrictions imposed on Niger from July 2023, the Sahel's revolutionary government chose to respond by deepening their coordination rather than reversing course. On 16 September 2023, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger created the Alliance of Sahel States as a defense pact to provide mutual assistance in case of external aggression or threats to their sovereignty. On 28 January 2024, they issued a joint statement announcing their withdrawal from ECOWAS under ECOWAS treaty provisions that the pacture became effective after a one-year notice period, reaching a climax in a formal exit on July 29, 2025. Now, during this period, the three states also signed a treaty in Niamey on 6 July 2024 to establish a confederation of Sahel states, outlining plans for joint forces, common policies, and closer integration, including a step such as introducing AES biometric passports and planning a unified military unit. In December, they formally activated the Confederal Investment Development Bank, which is BCID AES, with initial capital of 500 billion CFA francs, roughly $820 to $900 million. These are not symbolic gestures. These are institutions being built in real time. In official narratives from this government, this path is framed as liberation rather than isolation, a strategic decision to leave frameworks they characterize as influenced by foreign interests and to build new security and economic partnerships on terms they can better control. They have sought to diversify alliances, including closer ties with Russia, Turkey, Iran, and other non-Western partners, while addressing domestic and African audiences directly through speeches, statements, and media that present their stance as a test case for past colonial sovereignty. Measures initially designed to pressure them back into established regional structures are frequently reinterpreted in their communications as confirmation that they are challenging deeper patterns of dependence and external influence. Diaspora networks and youth-oriented Pan-African platforms have amplified this framing, often portraying the Sahel bloc as experimenting with a more assertive model of sovereignty rather than simplify breaking rules. Analysts note that if these states manage to maintain stability and basic state funding outside the traditional reach of ECOWAS and under more distant relations with the AU, other governments facing similar pressures may reassess whether remaining fully aligned with the current arrangement is the only credible path. In that scenario, what started as a dispute focused on three countries could evolve into a broader continental test over who sets the standards for legitimate power and regional cooperation. Beneath images of unity at AU Summit, the Sahel confrontation highlights a deeper divide in political thinking across the continent. One current of opinion often visible in long-established ruling parties, diplomatic services, and segments of the bureaucracy, argues that state survival and economic resilience still depend on remaining within donor-supported frameworks, preserving access to concessional finance, trade preference, and security assistance, even when these arrangements are criticized as unequal. Another current, or more prominent in Sahel capitals, peripheral regions, and some online Pan-African spaces, maintains that substantial liberation requires either breaking or fundamentally renegotiating those frameworks entirely. This clash runs through institutions and generations, as well as between capitals. Debates among political and diplomatic elites in Addis Ababa, Abuja, and coastal cities often stress risk management, institutional community, and incremental reform of existing treaties and norms. Now, in Bamako, Ouagadougou, Niamey, and diaspora centers more frequently highlight the persistence of insecurity and limited economic change under post-1990s governance models, and question why heavily criticized systems should be so vigorously defended. You cannot tell people who are burying their children because of a security failure that the system that produced that failure is the only legitimate one. Commentators already situate the AU along a spectrum that runs from overdependent on donors to potentially transformative, with the Union's handling of the Sahel crisis and its colonial crimes. Now, from this vantage point, several paths are visible. The AU could choose to reinforce its current line, maintaining or intensifying sanctions and legal tools in the hope that pressure will bring the Sahel states back into existing frameworks and deter similar actions elsewhere. Alternatively, more member states could begin to question this approach from within, arguing that firmly punishing revolutionary governments while formally condemning colonialism and slavery as crimes sends mixed signals about which forms of power and injustice are treated as legally intolerable. If the Union misjudges the balance between enforcement and inclusion, it risks not only losing influence over 3 Sahel countries, but also weakening the morale and political authority it seeks to project in wider global negotiations. As security crisis continues in parts of the Sahel, economies come under strain and external powers. They adjust their own strategies in the region. Pressure is mounting on the African Union to complement punitive measures with political initiatives that address root causes. Now, civil society organizations, researchers, and Pan-African advocates increasingly connect the AU's new resolution, aiming slavery, deportation, and colonization as genocide and crimes against African people, with the underlying grievances that revolutionary leaders in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger say they are responding to. They argue that if historical colonial structures are now officially classified as criminal at continental level, the contemporary arrangement seen as reducing similar hierarchies cannot remain entirely shielded from scrutiny. You cannot call the disease a crime and then protect the symptoms. This situation brings the Union to a strategic crossroads. One possible trajectory centers on reconciliation and reform, a negotiated framework for the Sahel states, re-engagement with continental institutions, combined with efforts to address security failures, perception of external dominance, and economic distortions that contributed to their break with ECOWAS and tensions with the AU. Another trajectory would see a firmer line in which more governments that step outside donor-backed or treaty-based templates are labeled as committing unconstitutional acts and face long-term isolation, and will widening the gap between formal legally and popular perception of justice in affected societies. For Africans on the continent and in the diaspora, these choices have direct consequences rather than remaining theoretical. They influence who design overseas security operations, how revenues from natural resources are distributed, and which forms of suffering and dispossessions are prioritized when laws and resolutions are written and enforced. The Sahel question has expanded beyond 3 member states into a wider reflections of the direction of African integration and credibility of continental institutions. Over time, this period is likely to be judged by how the AU handled a central challenge, whether it remained largely within inherited boundaries while adopting stronger language on historical crimes, or whether it used the formal criminalization of colonialism as a basis to revisit how law and order are defined and amplified from an African standpoint, even when that requires engaging with uncomfortable forms of rebellion. This is Frontline Africa. If this kind of unfiltered Africa First analysis resonates with you, make sure you're subscribed. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next story. And drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear what you think. My name is P. Solomon, and I'll see you in the next one.